It's amazing when this level of kind of quote unquote cancel culture or not being willing to go outside the lines then leads us to the extreme of saying, no, these people don't really exist. Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm John Stonestreet, and sitting in once again for Shane Morris is Maria Baer. Maria, welcome back to Breakpoint this week.
Hi, John. I'm very happy to be here. It is an absolute blizzard outside. So I'm glad that this doesn't require any on the street reporting.
No on the street reviewing. It's not snowing here, but it actually is pretty cold and only getting colder. I think it's called a polar vortex or something, isn't it?
That sounds terrible. I would not like to be a part of that. I
Well,
just
I
know
think
I haven't
it.
seen the sun in like 4 weeks. So,
Well, I saw on a news report it's the Russians' fault, or it's something about Siberia and the temperatures changing 90 degrees in 24 hours. But what that meant was it went from negative 80 to 10 degrees, and that pushed all the cold air over the polar caps, or something like that. So it's the Russians' fault.
I'm happy to blame Russia anytime I can. So that sounds good.
They're pretty convenient. Well, speaking of Russia, it's this week's news is dominated by the impeachment. You see what I did there?
Wow, that was good.
Yeah, I'm not sure it was actually connected at all, but we do have an impeachment trial of a second impeachment trial for President Trump, and I hesitate to kind of spend almost any time on it at all, just simply because my view at this point is that this is an awful lot of theater. There's the outcome is probably already predetermined. It's not going to actually accomplish anything. It's a kind of a way of kind of moral posturing on one side, and defending what was indefensible on the other side, and I'm not sure that it's really doing any of us any good. But I'm pretty cynical when it comes to this second go round.
Yeah, I think the only part of it that I find really interesting, I mean, I find the whole thing really sad. It's sad that this happened. It's sad that this is happening now. It's sort of one of those things, like I feel ashamed that this is the situation we're in. But one of the things I find really interesting is that the conversation seems to be a conversation about words. What did he say, and what was the effect of it? And I think we've been having that conversation culturally for a long time, and we need to kind of figure out what the truth is. Like, are words violence? Are words that spur somebody else to violence? I mean, I was told all throughout the Kavanaugh hearings that women, and no other qualifier, just women, were being held down, not believed, complete victims um, by the left. And if I really believed that and took them at their word, that might have spurned me on to action, in the same way that we had a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests here in Columbus over the summer. And at one point, there was a big picture in our local paper of a woman, an African American woman, standing on the State House steps with a sign behind her that said, "Black people are not safe on Columbus streets." And it just struck me. It was an odd photo because she was standing on the State House steps, and she obviously and thankfully was fine. But it also was like, that's rhetoric that I think would spur people to action as well. I think it's interesting that we're having that conversation now on the level that we are. What does it mean when a president says something that spurs people to this kind of violent action? And it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, it is. And then to what degree, did he say that? Did he intend that? And did he mean that? And, there's no possible way, to kind of get at the truth of this without assuming things about the meaning. And, the political lens through which each side sees it is going to predetermine the answer to what they think about that. And yet,
Sure.
words matter. Words matter greatly. As Christians, we should care more about words and what they mean than literally anybody else, because the Bible actually begins its story with the word, right? That it was the speech act of God that actually brought anything into existence. So what we say is inextricably tied to what is real. And so playing fast and loose with words and redefining them for our own purpose, or to try to recreate reality, or complete worldview systems that say, reality is whatever I say it is. All of those things are immediately dismissed from a Christian worldview because of the significance and importance of language. And it is interesting because we've had entire sectors of the American culture, obviously starting with education, but also going into the arts, even just that kind of silly saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. It might be that a word's worth 1,000 pictures, right? I mean, even that saying literally, communicates what we believe about words. And that's one of the realities of kind of our post, I don't know how many posts we're in, modern, realities is that we can play fast and loose with words.
Yeah.
Our side gets away with it. If it's our side, their side never gets away with it if it's their side. And at the same time, we're just nowhere nearer to actually being able to have communication, to the point where, that's kind of the point of postmodernism, is a cynicism that any sort of real communication is even possible. So that to then turn around and say we're certain about what these words were and what these words mean, there's just a lot of inconsistency there. And yeah. And of course, at the same time, we have a new administration implementing new policies, again, using language in particular ways, like women's reproductive health and, the safety of LGBTQ persons and, kind of some of this nomenclature that really drives agenda items.
Yeah. And I think one of the crux of that matter, because as we know in the Bible, where do words come from? The heart. Like, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. I don't know if that's a proverb or where that is exactly, but
it's in there.
It's in there. And I think, to me, that is another really powerful argument for the fact that the moral character of our leaders does matter in a practical way, not just a symbolic way or an emotional way, but that if we can't just say, we've heard that argument so many times about we're not electing a pastor, we're not looking for somebody perfect, we're not looking for another Jesus. I agree with all of that. But too often, I think that was used to cast doubt on any importance that a person's character would have. And if we believe, like you said, I think Christians are the ones who believe the most in the power of words, and we know the connection that words have with character, then character has to matter in the leaders that we elect. And, people will say the wrong things, and even good things people say will be taken the wrong way. We can't hold everybody responsible for what anybody else who hears them does with the message they heard. But it's still important.
Yeah, it is. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint this week. I'm John Stonestreet here along with Maria Baer, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. And for more on the various stories that we are talking about, you can join us at breakpoint.org, and we'll link to the various articles and resources that we mentioned on today's program. Also want to mention, too, that this week is the launch of our next short course through the Colson Center, featuring Dr. Thaddeus Williams of Biola University on confronting injustice without compromising truth. We'll talk more about that as the program goes on. You're listening to Breakpoint this week. We'll be right back. Well, we're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Maria Baer, sitting in for Shane Morris this week as we talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. We have spent so much of the last year talking about politics. I want to kind of move on. But obviously, one of the other things that has gone along with so much that's happened over the last couple of years is this idea of what people are calling cancel culture or wokeness. We had another example of that this week. Actress Gina Carano, who stars in The Mandalorian, and I've got to admit, I saw the story and didn't know who she was. I'm not a Mandalorian fan, although I hear it's actually a pretty great series. Do you know anything about this?
Okay, I am such a diehard Star Wars episodes 4 through 6, like the original trilogy, and I love it so much that I kind of refuse to watch anything other than that. So no, I know nothing about The Mandalorian except that it's not episodes 4 through 6.
Is that right? Well, people who hate, and rightly so, the prequel ones that were made with Anakin and all that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. Still love the Mandalorian. So
I've heard it's good,
that's
and
what I'm
my husband
hearing.
likes it. My husband
All
likes it.
right. So Gina Carano, though, who was slated, I think, by most reports to return, was canceled. She was disinvited. Now, of course, I was asked actually earlier this weekend, Maria, on a broadcast. I also do a weekly podcast with World Magazine called "The World and Everything in It," something you've also contributed to, I think, and do a weekly segment called Culture Friday. And the co-host there, Myrna Brown, asked me, is this cancel culture or is this the right of a corporation, to handle policy violations? And my answer was yes, it's both, right? Because that's one of the storylines of this kind of new way of seeing the world, dealing with disagreement, and so on, is kind of weaponizing employment, weaponizing pay, weaponizing opportunity financially. And if you kind of think about culture, and different people categorize this different ways, whether seven mountains or seven spheres or whatever, you can kind of see where some of these ideas, especially about issues of critical theory or issues about sexual orientation and gender identity. We know that those ideas have taken root in areas like education and the arts, and that's been a long time coming. But it's that shift to corporate America that has kind of tightened those vice grips around our freedoms at a whole new level. And so, in my mind, this is kind of the new world where there's a level of corporate responsibility. And by the way, there's a good side to that, right? I mean, there's a side to which, for example, there really wasn't any recourse at one point for women who had been mistreated or so on in corporate America to go to. And so waking America up, to use that word, waking corporate America up to those realities is a good thing. And yet, this is a two-edged sword. So there's that part of this story. And then there's also, and you brought this up here as we were talking before the program, about what she actually said. And I want to deal with that just a little bit. Tell me what you mean, what did she actually say?
Right. So she said, let me see if I can pull it up here and read it. She was talking about Nazi Germany. This, I guess she posted this on her Instagram story. So that only lives online for a brief moment and then it's gone. But here's what she said. Jews were beaten in the streets, not by Nazi soldiers, but by their neighbors, even by children. Because history is edited, most people today don't realize that to get to the point where Nazi soldiers could easily round up thousands of Jews, the government first made their own neighbors hate them simply for being Jews. How is that any different from hating someone for their political views? So I think what she was, it's a clumsy way of saying it, because to suggest that Nazi soldiers were not actually killing Jews is ludicrous, right? We obviously know that that's false. But I think what she was getting at is that a political party or a government can't exert that kind of power, especially that kind of murderous power, if they don't at least believe that they have some sort of the public will behind them. So I think she was suggesting that we have to grapple with the fact that the government in Nazi Germany, the Nazi Party, was effective in convincing the general public that Jews were their enemies, that what the Nazis were about to do, which was motivated by a pure hatred of Jews, was going to be good and for their benefit because look how bad Jews are. So she was saying it wasn't like there was this small cadre of really bad Nazi soldiers and then the rest of the public was like really progressive and loved their neighbors. Like the Nazi government knew how to run a very successful PR campaign. And I think she was calling that similar to what we have now with some of the groupthink we have going on. I don't like generally likening things to Nazi Germany unless you have a Holocaust happening. I think that devalues like the Holocaust and what actually happened, and we way overuse those analogies anyway. But what I think is interesting about this, and like what you talked about with Myrna in terms of cancel culture, is one of the big differences I see between a corporation making like a good judgment call and cancel culture is that usually when it's something that I would consider cancel culture, it's not because the corporation thinks this person might hurt their coworkers or this could be a negative for our project. They're worried about PR. Like they're worried about the reactions of basically a social media mob. We talked about a story earlier this week of a guy, a psychologist in the UK who wants to do his master's studying detransitioners, so people who've gone through hormone therapy or surgery because they believe that they're in the wrong gender, and then who later detransition. He wanted to study it. The university told him no, he couldn't study that for his master's. And they didn't say, we don't think this is a good area of study, or we don't think you're qualified to study that. They literally said, we think that the reaction on Twitter will reflect poorly on the university. That to me is a better argument against cancel culture than if somebody, you have an employee who has like some really violent views or some views that make you feel like this person could be dangerous for our employees or that kind of thing. That's a different judgment call.
Well, and the thing that I kind of was confused about, and I think this line came from the Disney execs when they decided to cancel Gina Carano, is they used the word abhorrent for her comments, like, that this was just beyond the pale. And I read it and thought, well, it was sloppy and it didn't make a whole lot of sense and it wasn't historically accurate. But to call it just like beyond the pale, like no one should ever think those thoughts, right? It's clear that the German people gave some level of permission to the Nazi Party. It's also clear that many of them thought the Nazis were terrible people. It's also clear that there was other groups in Nazi Germany who believed that the Jews were a problem, but the Nazis were going too far, right? I mean, there's all of these degrees, but to say that the German people didn't play a role in this, which is obviously what her main point was. But again, there's nothing about what she says that made anybody unsafe, is there? I mean, I can't see anything there that would be an imminent and immediate warning that this person might, become violent or, might actually, hurt another coworker or anything like that. It was just a silly thing to say, and it wasn't said well. And so on. And I think that really, and the reason they got such, blowback on this, and there was this Twitter campaign. And look, that's a whole nother angle to this, right? So the power that we have given the Twitter mob to determine what's good and bad in our society, this is not a sustainable plan, right? This is not the way forward on almost any level, certainly not for academia, but not for anywhere else. Were they upset because they felt like she was comparing, liberals or conservatives to Nazis? I mean, like, what was the point of comparison here? I mean, what made it anything more than just a historically misspoken statement? I'm sure she was trying to make a different point, but what was the connection?
Yeah, I don't think they've even clarified what the problem was, whether the problem was that she said that Nazi soldiers didn't kill Jewish people, or if the problem was that she likened groupthink to the Nazis. And just the fact that we don't even know what was supposed to be abhorrent about this is just, again, this isn't about like actual dealings with people. It's about mob justice and the fear of the mob.
Yeah. I think there's two other things that I wanted to bring up on this one. The first is a kind of a worldview underpinning here, because one of the things I think that undergirds the woke mob or the cancel culture, whatever it is, and as somebody wrote this week, look, cancel culture happens on the right and the left, and I think that's probably true. And it's the result. I think there's two levels of it on a worldview. If we look at it on a worldview framework, I've long appreciated a comment, and I heard it attributed to Father Sirico of the Acton Institute more than 20 years ago. So I'm not sure he actually said it. I asked him once, and he was like, "Did I say that?" So he wasn't sure either. But that's where I saw it, credited. And it said we have to be ruthless with ideas and gentle with people. And that's a really good way to go about things as a Christian, right? That we believe that humans are worthy of dignity and respect, and that ideas are so important because they impact people that we are going to be ruthless with those and really make sure we get things right. It strikes me that that one of the things that's dominating cancel culture, whether you see it on the left or even I think where you see it on the right, is that has become the exact opposite, right? We are gentle with ideas. And what I mean by gentle with ideas is we're fragile, right? We handle them with soft gloves. We don't do the hard work of actually thinking thoughts and making responses. It's way easier to just deflect them, like putting ourselves in bubble wrap from ideas, and that's what I mean by gentle. And we're ruthless with people. So, we almost have this thing exactly backwards. The other thing that struck me on this, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, because this seems to me undergirding so much of this is something that C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. We've talked about this a lot here on the podcast. Shane and I have, because Shane, references C.S. Lewis
Every 40
almost
seconds.
segment by segment. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there it is. I think it's like there's a counter. It's like, oh, it's been 10 seconds since we mentioned Lewis. It's time to bring him back. But chronological snobbery is one of the most helpful descriptions of what we deal with, where basically we think that we're morally superior to those who have gone before us. Now, he was also talking about being kind of scientifically superior, technologically superior, so therefore being better. But our version of it is very like morally superior. Like we would know who the good guys and bad guys are. And it seems like the outrage on this, right, has to do with the Nazis are the clear bad guys of that story, and the rest of society, and especially the elites and so on, that it was the Nazis who did all the bad stuff there. And the fact of the matter is, it wasn't. The fact of the matter is, in wartime, both sides do bad stuff. The fact of the matter is, there are no good guys and bad guys. We're all bad guys, right? And it seems like the moral superiority, like we know who the good guys and bad guys, and they're the ones that were always on our side, it undergirds so much of this kind of what I'll call faux outrage, and that's what I think it is.
It sort of makes me think of like that we're culturally on a global scale in the 5 stages of grief, and we're in the denial stage where we're like, things are going wrong, but there's no way it's my fault. Like it couldn't be me. And if it couldn't be me, then human beings can't be bad, like categorically. Like we can't have a fallen human nature. So I'm going to grasp for any other possible explanation. And of course, what's the best other possible explanation? It was you. It was somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we go. It's like a defense mechanism against the fear that like the calls coming from inside the house. Like we're all part of this nastiness and we all have the tendency to be nasty. And if we really want things to get better, we'll have to make sacrifices, which doesn't sound like fun. And, the irony of this kind of groupthink, though, is that, and the chronological snobbery you're talking about, which exists in like philosophy and morality, but also in science and education and all these other areas. The irony of it is it's actually the opposite of progress. Like it's the last thing you'd want if you want to make progress. I was reading this piece a couple weeks ago. There's a book that came out from a quantum physicist. I don't know. It's way beyond my level of intelligence, but he's like he's a philosopher of physics, basically. But at the end of his book, he wrote this epilogue that was like, we cannot make the academic climate right now, the way scientific inquiry is set up in the world, is set up in such a way that we cannot make advancements. Because the reason is we do not award people who take left turns and explore questions that nobody's ever thought of before. You can't get tenure, you can't get research funding unless you study something within frameworks that we've already accepted. And I think part of that is because we have this chronological snobbery, we're like, we couldn't possibly have spent the last 100 years on this area of research in physics and have been wrong about it because we're better than everybody that came before us. So even though none of our theories seem to be working out, you can't study something outside of these theories because then you're suggesting that we're not the smartest generation and we can't tolerate that. But then again, the irony is we'll never make any progress. We'll never get anywhere forward from here because we just keep trying the wrong theories over and over again. And I think that's a metaphor for what's happening in philosophy and morality as well.
Well, your example of this article, which we'll probably be mentioning on a Breakpoint commentary in the days to come, of somebody wanting to study detransitioners.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, they're very the people know we know people like this. These people actually exist. I mean, it's amazing when this level of kind of quote unquote cancel culture or not being willing to go outside the lines then leads us to the extreme of saying, no, these people don't really exist. I know you say you exist, but you don't really exist. I know you claim to be a person who regrets their abortion, who regrets their transition, or who no longer feels same sex attractions, or whatever. But you don't really exist. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here along with Maria Baer, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. We'll be right back. Back on Breakpoint This Week, John Stonestreet here along with Maria Baer. We continue to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. We spent a lot of time in that last segment, Maria, talking about the idea of woke and cancel culture and the story of Gina Carano, which made headlines, another kind of Twitter mob success story, I guess you could say. But I want to go and we did a little bit of worldview analysis about ideas and people and so on. But there was another and this is an article, and this is going to give us, or at least me, an opportunity to go straight worldview nerd with everybody, because I find this absolutely fascinating, and I'm not sure everybody else will, so we'll just kind of see how it goes. Article in the New York Times this week: Will American ideas tear France apart? Some of its leaders think so. Now, what was surprising about this is because of the push to nationalism and the tendency of many media outlets to blame nationalism for all of our problems, including the rest of the world's problems, I assumed they were talking about those American ideals kind of being, people call it the Trumpian politics being, exported to other countries and, these other nationalist population centers and other places. They weren't talking about that. They were talking about social theories. Listen to this. Here's the subtitle. Politicians and prominent intellectuals say social theories from the United States on race, gender, and post-colonialism, and by the way, that's code words for wokeness, right, are a threat to French identity and the French Republic. In other words, you have French leaders saying, this kind of, progressive thought that's kind of dominating universities and entertainment and so on, this could be a threat. It even is called an existential threat. Could fuel secessionism. Could tear apart national unity. Things like that. And even the president, Emmanuel Macron, said it. I mean, this is a fascinating article that the French would be like, you're going too far. One reason, and this is my worldview nerd. Let me get this in.
John's in his happy place right now.
I am in my happy place because post-colonialism, critical theory of its various kinds, the way we talk about feminism, the way we talk about race these days, these are all stepchildren of postmodernism, which came from France. Like French philosophers. I mean, look, French philosophers created this. I mean, the definition of postmodernism, which is an incredulity toward meta-narrative, which one of my favorite things to say to a crowd anywhere, because it was said by a French philosopher named Jean-François Lyotard, which I always say is a very unfortunate name, especially if you're in junior high, right? So these are French ideas that America has taken and abused, like we could say, like French fries, right? And shipping them back, and we have caused a political crisis. And now, look, America's pretty, it probably has a history of taking French things and making them worse, and then gifting it back to the larger world. I just thought this article was fascinating.
Yeah, it really is, and it's ironic because I also read a story in the Times this week that some evangelical associations in France are feeling really worried right now because the politicians there are considering something called the Republican Principles Law. I don't know if that translates exactly, but basically they're worried about the spread of Islamism, which has led to, as we know, several terrorist attacks, like really bloody, terrible attacks in the past 5 years in France. But I think out of fear of Islam, being accused of Islamophobia or xenophobia or whatever it would be, they're targeting all religious groups, and it's a really unfortunate law. It's like churches have to register. You can't accept a certain amount of funding that comes from other countries, which would really hurt lower churches or lower income churches or smaller churches that are maybe supported internationally. And like sermons will be monitored for hate speech, and it's just like the worst kind of things you could think of. They're trying to promote this law at the same time as, well, we're really worried about this, you know, wokeism. Like those two are the same things, because a tenet of wokeism is that you don't deal with ideas based on the content of the ideas. It only matters who is propagating them and what race they are, essentially, and sometimes what gender they are. But then to turn around and say, we have this certain set of ideas that seems to be encouraging people to propagate these terrible terrorist attacks, and we need to deal with these ideas. Um, you can't really be logically consistent and do those two things. You know what I mean? Like if you're going to deal with ideas, you got to deal with ideas. If you're going to accept wokeism as the meta narrative, then you can't deal with the ideas. It only matters who's saying it. And in a case like that, I think the problem of Islamism becomes an even bigger problem because,
Mm-hmm.
as we've seen, like in the Western media, Islam is considered the religion of the underprivileged. Like these are largely non-white people in the Arab world who are, come from a lot of impoverished nations, not all, but
Mm-hmm.
some. And so you have groups of people claiming that religion doing really terrible things. It becomes really hard if you've accepted wokeism to decide what to do in a case like that. And I guess the answer is go after all religious groups, even though I
Right.
think all ideas are the same and equal. And yeah, that's a problem. It's weird. It sort of was like I totally understand, obviously, and identify with the concerns that a lot of these French professors and other people that the Times interviewed in the story you're talking about. I agree with their concerns, but it's not new. It's not only happening on the ground in like street protests in Paris. It's
Right.
also happening. This law is an example of what happens when that kind of thinking makes its way into the more practical spheres of politics and that kind of thing.
The historic French philosophers, and I'm thinking, obviously Friedrich Nietzsche is known as kind of the godfather because of eliminating categories of right and wrong or good and evil, basically saying that knowledge was a function of power, not a function of reality, and so on. And then, seeing kind of the failures of the early 20th century meta narratives, like some of these that were built on social Darwinism, like Nazism, seeing the horrific thing that happens when you try to totalize your truth for the rest of the world. That's where a lot of these French philosophers emerged. A lot of people hear postmodernism and they think, oh, that's an anti-Christian philosophy. It's certainly a non-Christian philosophy, but it was in response as much to modernism and the promises of progress and utopia than anything else, and kind of pointing out bias. And that's what's so interesting about where this has evolved, because basically going back to Nietzsche, and at one point in the late 20th century, the most quoted academic source was Nietzsche. The second most quoted academic source right behind that was Michel Foucault, who's often called Nietzsche's most literal disciple. So Foucault, and Jacques Derrida takes this idea of no, universals and applies it to words and language. Foucault takes it and applies it to cultural structures, things like crime and sex and all kinds of other things. And the idea was to de-privilege the privileged Western perspectives and to create space for these other views. What's happened now, but it was built on this idea that we'd never actually get to knowledge. The whole thing was a power game. So basically, whereas the postmodern philosophers were trying to deprivilege the powerful, what's happened is once the powerful were deprivileged, somebody took their place, right? Now we have a new powerful, privileged position. And look, they can snap their fingers and, you lose your job on the Mandalorian sort of thing. They can snap your fingers and you can be a secular humanist evolutionist at Evergreen State University. And because you dare show your face on campus the day you're not supposed to because of your race,
Right.
you're fired and put into the same category as right-wing extremist. The power dynamics here are so fascinating to watch. And the thing about postmodernism is it reduces everything down to those power dynamics and says there's nothing but power dynamics. What Christianity does is it looks at fallen human nature and how that implies it, how it works itself out in structures and institutions, and says, yeah, a whole lot of this is power dynamics, and people do abuse other people. But good news, there is someone who is powerful because he was weak. His name was Jesus. Good news, there's someone whose foolishness is wise. His name is Jesus. And that's, I always thought, I was once asked, if you weren't a Christian, what would you be? And I always thought, well, I'd be a postmodernist, because without that security of the Word made flesh of who Jesus is, everything is a power struggle. Everything is an illusion of trying to privilege my own meta narrative over somebody else. Maybe I'm a Gen Xer, right? We're cynical. We were the first postmodern generation. I blame it on Kurt
I
Cobain,
think
right? I mean, that's who we were, right? But
you're in your sweet
yeah.
spot.
Sorry,
You're in your
you
sweet
got
spot.
me
Don't let me
going. I
stop you. I
told
was
you
just
I'd
gonna
love
say,
this sort of
I
thing. It's
think
fascinating.
love. You're in your sweet
I
spot.
am.
You're in your sweet spot. Don't let me stop you. I was just gonna say, I think love. So love and power struggle are two
Hmm.
absolute opposites. Like I think they're the perfect antithesis of each other. If you don't have love, that's you will get a power struggle. They're the exact opposite. Love is a person who could take power and decides not to, like Jesus. Love is a person who doesn't take advantage of you when they could. Love is a person who asks you to be better than you are. Like, I think there's nothing more condescending than sort of diminishing people down to this kind of power struggle, what group are you in type of thing, because it's condescending both in the positive and negative, right? It's saying if you're in the current, or if you're white, basically, you can do nothing right. There's nothing like morally okay with anything that you do. If you're on the other side, you can do nothing wrong. Both of that is extremely condescending. Like you could find people who have lived in terrible, abject poverty, who have been undeniably oppressed their entire life, disadvantaged at every turn, and they could turn around and oppress someone else and
You
be
know,
a cruel person
not to
because they're
jump in,
human
but
beings.
I am going to jump in because you said not to interrupt and then you interrupted. So I'm going to pay you right back. No, I'm just kidding. But in all of this, this week, I found this fascinating. Same news source, New York Times, only it was on their podcast, telling the story, a horrific story of a man who came out of homelessness because of addictions and so many other things. Unfortunately, it was one of the parts of his story. I say unfortunately. Let me play this out before everybody cancels me. Part of that story was coming to Christ, finding freedom from his addiction, starting up one of the largest homeless organizations in New York City, and has just been completely exposed as a serial abuser of women, extortion, using money. And that's exactly an example of the scenario you just offered, that somebody like that could turn around and then be the oppressor. That's exactly the story that was told on the Daily podcast this week.
Yeah. And that's what you get when you pretend that ideas and content doesn't matter and it just matters what group you belong to. Then you trade in one set of masters for another instead of getting, a totalitarian rich government. You get, a set of quote unquote little people who will oppress you just the same. Just it'll just look a little bit different, and that's because humans are humans. And
Yeah, I think there was this kind of fantasy of the early postmodern theorist, and maybe less so the theorist. I mean, you can't really call Friedrich Nietzsche an optimist about human nature, or Jacques or Michel Foucault. Derrida probably more was, but there was this real, I think this feature of the early postmodern champions, particularly on university campuses. And again, it goes back to that chronological snobbery. Like if we get rid of the privileged, powerful perspective, then we are actually going, we'll build a world in which there's tolerance and diversity, and all that code language, right? We won't do that oppression. And the thing about the fall is that we should all be absolutely terrified of what we would do if we thought no one was actually watching. And this idea that, once we deprivilege the privileged, we won't make that same mistake is just a fundamental flaw in the perspective. And that's one of the reasons, I think it was Chesterton who said, the fall of man or original sin is the most empirically verifiable of all the Christian doctrines. You can actually see it on display.
Yeah. So I was going to say one of the issues is that the concept of privilege is so nebulous. We haven't really decided how to define that. And I think a lot of people, especially people who consider themselves high-minded, are not willing to say, what I mean when I say privilege is money. Like when I say we need to
Yeah.
deprivilege X, I just kind of want your money because that sounds really debased and anti-intellectual and whatever else. But if that's not what you mean, it's really, really hard to define because we think of suffering, we see suffering play out as an absolute, right? You could have you could have the guy who started Zappos commit suicide like he did recently, right? One of the richest people in the world. We know that suffering can happen to anybody, regardless of them having whatever we consider to be privilege. And I think that's one of the lies that will come back and is coming back to haunt us is that if you define privilege as money, for example, and then one group loses it and another group gets it, the group that gets it is going to quickly discover it's not what they thought it was. It's not going to give them what they thought they were missing. And then that's going to be a whole other explosion. And that's the path, unfortunately, I think we're on. Because you could argue that like a day trader and a woman in a third world country who can't feed her kids, they might feel as stressed as the other one feels. The object of their stress is very different. We might scoff at that, like one woman's trying to feed her kids, the other guy is trying not to lose $1,000 or whatever. But they could have the same physiological response, like it
Yeah.
feels the same to them. So how do you define privilege if it's not just money? And if it's money,
Yeah.
that's
No,
ugly.
you're yeah, you're exactly right. I lived in Jamaica for a year, and it hit me about 6 months in that I lived on the coast in Montego Bay where there's a lot of tourism, and I realized very quickly that a deep sin of that city was the same as the deep sin of New York City, which is materialism. The difference is one had the material that they wanted, the other didn't have the material that they wanted. One wanted more, the other wanted any, but the same false god was there for both ways. And I also appreciated Dr. Anthony Bradley of the King's College once pointed me to a book called The Price of Privilege, which if you're privileged and you get to move to the suburbs, that's actually maybe not giving your kid a head start because the richest suburbs in America have the highest rates of sexual brokenness, addiction, suicidal ideations, and so on. I think that's a really powerful point. Hey, I want to get to one more story here before we close out today's podcast, and that is there was actually a handful of individuals that passed away. It's kind of the rule of threes. I don't know if we're at 3 or 4 of celebrities or stars who passed away. Hank Aaron being one of them, just a remarkable person with a remarkable story. Had to go through just an incredible amount of personal attack and social stigma in order to become really one of the greatest athletes of all time. Just really an amazing story there. And also, I believe, as a man of faith. But there's also another individual that passed away this week. Didn't make as many headlines, although he would have maybe 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. And that's Larry Flynt, the creator of Hustler magazine. Of course, Hugh Hefner passed away, 3 or 4 years ago. And I don't want to say it's the end of an era. I was asked about that on an interview this week. Is this the end of an era with those two guys moving on? And I thought, well, no, they won, right? I mean, first of all, Hugh Hefner was directly trying to apply the ideas of Alfred Kinsey. No one would listen to Alfred Kinsey, of course, because he's creepy as a social thinker. But it gets to the point that ideas have consequences, but in order for ideas really to spread, they need champions. And the most effective champions of ideas are artists and educators. And, we were talking about playing fast and loose with words earlier in the program, so I hesitate to use the word artist with Hugh Hefner or Larry Flynt. But what I mean is that they basically tried to go around reason, go around morality, and go right to titillate your imagination. And of course, Flint did it I think Hefner probably had a more coherent worldview philosophy shaped by the sexual revolution than Flint, who just seemed to say, if I appeal to the basest instincts of Americans, I'll make a lot of money. And he did. But I guess the thing I want to say, Maria, is that, they won the cultural imagination. In other words, even though we live in an age where, for example, Pornhub is under great attack, it's under great attack not because of its fundamental ideas about sexuality and human nature. It's under attack because we only have one slim, almost broken strand of morality when it comes to sex, and that's the word consent, which is hardly definable. But the attack on Pornhub, the attempt to take it down, is because of it posting videos of abuse or posting videos of traffic victims or posting videos of underage. In other words, not because of all the other horrific things or the terrible ideas that have terrible consequences for people or their lack of control over their platform for minors or anything else. It only has to do with consent, which goes to basically the rules of the sexual revolution. It's kind of like when people say, well, liberal Christianity lost because they have the emptiest churches in America. And it's like, well, liberal Christianity has the emptiest churches in America because you can hear their ideas every day on NPR, right? In other words, they lost their churches, but they won the culture. And it seems to me that there's a whole lot of similarity here when it comes to guys like Larry Flint and Hugh Hefner.
Yeah. I think they're both just really pathetic people. I mean, it's sad to hear of their passing, but I was reading some of his bio, like divorced twice before he was 21. Like, just what a waste of a life, honestly. I hope that he came to know the Lord, but I certainly didn't see any fruit of that in his public life, at least. But yeah, I think with the Pornhub thing too, like, I think you're right. I think they would even be considered, those guys, like, antiquated, I think. And not because, like, they had these terrible ideas and we've improved, but, like, they had great ideas, they just didn't go far enough, kind of thing. And now, look, we have it at our fingertips and at any time of day and in any scenario we want and all that kind of grotesque stuff. A couple years ago in college, Ron Jeremy came. So he's apparently this adult film star, really gross-looking dude, who came and debated like a Christian apologist, and it was this huge event on campus. And one of the things he kept saying over and over was like, listen, I don't advocate for, I would never use any underage actresses, and I would never, all this kind of stuff. And there was a question and answer session afterward, and I was like, oh, I'm going to get him. I'm so smart, and I'm just totally going to take him down. So I go up to the microphone, and I'm like, so why wouldn't you do that, though? Like, you're saying that, like, free sex, all of this is totally fine. There's no morality, there's no question of morality involved in this whatsoever, but like then it seems kind of arbitrary that you have all these other rules, like, for what reason? And I, as you could imagine, got like booed out of there, and he was very brilliantly like, oh, you want us to use children, oh, you want us to use trafficked victims, is that what you're suggesting? And yeah, that was a nice lesson for me in hubris. But anyway, I think I was right. Like, you can't, why would you claim any sort of moral standard on some sides of the equation? It's like, we want to talk about everything but the actual issue, which is like the depravity of using sexuality that way. But we'll just talk about it in all these other smaller areas, like children and, something called consent that we don't know how to define and whatever else. We refuse to talk about the actual thing.
I do think there's a silver lining to this dark cloud that I don't want to end the program on, and that is that just even the Pornhub story, the inconsistency, another set of accusations this week against a Hollywood star, just the, why does this keep happening articles that we read everywhere when it comes to sexual abuse or sexual exploitation or anything like that. The culture is out of ideas on sex. We're not that far from the edge of the abyss. Now, that's hard, but, the sexual revolution sold this idea of sexual freedom as freedom, and it's turned out to be anything but. And this isn't the first time that it's happened in human history. Like, this is one of the interesting parts of the scholarship having to do with the early church. And Tom Holland writes about this, and some others have written about this as well. That the dominant kind of narrative is that the pagans were having a whole lot of fun, and the Christians brought in all their prudish ideas about sex and just got in the way. But what we're now realizing is that no, that all that fun was reserved for a select group of powerful people, and then everyone else were the victims of those powerful people, and particularly women and children paid the price. And so when this radical idea that sex belongs in the context of marriage becomes life-giving, it becomes like a breath of fresh air. It becomes like, oh, this is a way better idea, than, I should, just prepare myself to be, manipulated or abused at any point. In other words, the Christian view of sex was good news.
Right.
And I think we forget that. I think we forget how powerful that was historically, and really how powerful that it can be again. I mean, look, that's where, for example, second wave feminists got it exactly wrong when they said that marriage was, a tool of oppression or a prison against women. Now, certainly marriage and how it was done in some societies and how it was abused certainly is. But in the history of the world, in which if a man wanted a woman, he just took her, to now say, you've got to go to my dad first.
Yeah.
And, I know we look at the Old Testament and we're like, how is that okay that they, for six, cows or 7 years of labor, you got to, like, how is that okay? And the point is, at least he had to pay something.
It was a step up. Yeah.
It was, incredible step up. And it also made possible the ideas of marriage then that we saw flourish in the Victorian era and since, prior to the sexual revolution and the good that did the world. So I guess the silver lining here is that, remember, the Christian ideas about sex, our reputation as prudish and out of date and all that's going to be short-lived. Like, this is going to be seen as good news pretty quick.
In every parenting book you'll ever read, especially about younger children, it'll tell you at some point that what kids need to feel safe is boundaries. That you can't tell a kid, you can't tell a 4-year-old that they can make all the choices they want. You can decide what to wear, what to do all day, where to sleep, when to sleep, because they don't know how to make those decisions. They'll go crazy. Kids feel safer when you tell them these are the boundaries in which you can live. And of course, to know when to give them, the agency to make certain choices, but you make those rules for them so that they can do it safely. And you can easily understand in that relationship why that would make you feel safe. And I think that gets to the heart of what you're talking about, that sex was made for something in particular. And when we do it inside those boundaries, that's when it flourishes and is fulfilling for us. Did you see the skit on SNL last week about Zillow?
Oh, I've heard about it. No, I didn't see it. But basically that looking at homes has become the new pornography for millennials.
If you're in your late 30s and like you're married or you have a committed partner, that the new porn is looking at other houses. And I can't in good faith recommend the skit because it's kind of risque. But it's sort of, earlier on this podcast, you and I were talking about how, if you spend your life wishing you had money, when you get it, you will realize it's not going to do what you thought it was going to do. And I think our generation has spent its life calling for sexual freedom or for the antithesis of our supposed prudishness as Christians. And it's not going to fulfill what they think it was going to do. And that's already happening too. And then,
but it's, that's a reaction to what's become kind of the epidemic of non-relational sexuality. And our parents used to care about, premarital sex. We're talking now about a culture in which hookups that are done digitally are considered safe because you can give consent and you can have other people know about it in case something happens. Literally, that the whole idea of being able to have an intimate relationship or have a real relationship with another person that doesn't end in heartache is impossible. So we're just going to go for the sex and forego that, the risk. Or, of course, what we're seeing in Japan and Asia, which is, virtual reality taking the place of it. And you got to understand where that's coming from is a complete lack of breakdown of any faith whatsoever in relationships. It's not just that technology is making it more convenient. It's that if I have to choose whether to, risk myself or to, to actually, be courageous in the case of a man or be vulnerable in case of a woman, or vice versa. I mean, it's way safer to just do VR, right? Either emotionally, physically, or whatever. I mean, that's the sadness. That's why when you see, and I love Dr. Jenny Morse's, and she was just a guest on the Strong Women podcast, or she just got interviewed. It might not have aired yet, but she talks about the beauty of lifelong married love. And I think that's going to be beautiful again. I think it's going to be elevated again. I think people are going to be able to see it in our culture in a new way. So, well, look, we're at the end here of our program, but we need to do recommendations, and I imagine yours is going to be episodes 4 through 6 of Star Wars. Is that your
first of all,
recommendation?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Ewoks for life.
Ewoks, and yeah, I mean, people thought it all went down with Jar Jar Binks, but Ewoks came first.
Oh man, yeah, Ewoks are the best. I think I had a stuffed Ewok when I was a kid, but no, I'm not gonna recommend that because I just assume our audience is smart enough to have already seen it. I have 2 really quick ones, actually. The first one, and I feel obligated to mention this because I sort of stole from it in this conversation. There's an essay by a writer named Zadie Smith, who I think is brilliant. She wrote a book of essays during quarantine called Intimations, and she writes an essay about suffering and privilege and some of those ideas that you and I were talking about suffering. People feel it in an absolute way. That was something that she really explored. So it's called Intimations, a book by Zadie Smith. She's not a believer by any stretch. There might be some profanity in there. I don't remember seeing it, but just a little warning in case. But my real recommendation is Lent is this coming week, Wednesday. And several years ago, I heard a sermon from a Messianic Jewish rabbi he's a Jewish man who had come to believe in Jesus in his teens, I think. And he really challenged us by saying, Jewish people typically, devout Jewish people will have memorized the first 5 books of the Bible, in their early life. And he said, because of the way the Old Testament points to Jesus, he said a lot of Jewish people who don't believe in Jesus kind of know more about Jesus than a lot of us do, because we don't do as much reading and memorizing as that. And so he recommended reading the Gospels more. So every year since I heard him, it's been over 10 years, for Lent, I read all 4 Gospels. So it usually adds up to be about 3 or 4 chapters a day, and you'll get through it in the 40 days. But I've loved it. So that's my recommendation, is read the Gospels during Lent. It's really cool.
That is like, that story about, the Sunday school teacher asking a question and,
John, I just want you to try to give a recommendation that's holier than the one I just gave.
Than the one you just did. Yeah. What is it? It's like, what swallowed Jonah? And he's like, the answer's Jesus. I don't know why, but it's always Jesus. It's like your recommendation is read the Bible.
This is a competition, but I just won. So good luck.
You just, ding. We maybe on the video version of this, which you can catch on YouTube and Facebook, we'll put a little halo over your head right there. Just ding. That would be awesome. Well, actually, I made fun of you, but I think that's a great recommendation. We don't spend enough time, reading the Bible. And one of the reasons, and especially the Gospels, I mean, like Jesus has made himself known. And we've got one of our What Would You Say videos coming out in just a little bit on, I like Jesus but don't like religion, and that kind of false dichotomy between Jesus and Christianity. And it's just evidence that we want a Jesus that we make in our own image, when Jesus has really kind of revealed himself to be who he is, which is Jewish and building a church and the bridegroom of the bride and all kinds of different things. So I think that's really
emotional and man, he just jumps off the page, I think, when you really sit down and read it like that.
Yeah, that's great. You also see the differences in the Gospels and what each one wants to do, right? I mean, it's fascinating how different, for example, and of course a lot of people know this, but John's a fundamentally different book. John's got a very specific agenda that he's trying to accomplish. It's why he gives you the miracles he does and the conversations and discourses. That's why, half the book is 3 years and half the book is 1 week. And, all those details that are just very, very different than Mark, And certainly Matthew has a clear agenda. Well, look, I thought you were going to steal my recommendation, but you didn't. You just mentioned it. And my recommendation, and our listeners will know that I try to, sneak in some liturgy to the evangelical world as much as possible. In our weekly prayer time at Proverbs, I begin with a 12th century prayer and end with a 12th century prayer, and mainly because I think that we struggle to remember that we're part of the body of Christ, and that goes beyond our time period. The fellowship of believers. This is huge, but I also think that celebrating the church calendar, or at least honoring parts of the church calendar, can help get us in different rhythms. I've really appreciated learning over the last couple of years, because of a handful of authors, just how culture, kind of through osmosis gives us its worldview. And, we would never say, for example, that people are more important than, or that stuff is more important than people. But we live that way, and we know that it's a personal problem and a national problem, and it's not because we'd ever think that, or because if somebody gave a talk on it, we'd go forward and give our lives to stuff. I mean, that would never happen, right? We do it because it's just common. It's just rhythm. It's just habitual. And the power of habit is why the church, kind of fostered some of these things. And my family has found that, being in different rhythms, particularly around Christmas and leading up to Easter, can be really helpful. So I'm not telling anyone to become Anglican or Orthodox or any other, sort of liturgical faith, but I do think that both Advent and now as we enter Lent here on Wednesday with Ash Wednesday, that this is a very, very different rhythm. And of course, a lot of people associate this with, New Orleans and Carnival and Fat Tuesday and all that sort of stuff. And, that it's just a time to just, deprive yourself. But kind of Lenten habits involve not only giving something up, but bringing something on. And that was your recommendation, is I'm going to bring on the Gospels every year. And so I would recommend that if you are going to recognize Lent, do it liturgically. Do it not just like I'm just going to deprive myself, but follow the different days in the calendar. Give something up, but bring something on. Replace a bad habit with a good habit. Replace an okay habit with a better habit. That's what this season's about. So I appreciate that. It's meant a lot to our family. It's meant a lot to us and my wife especially. So that's my recommendation.
That's very cool. And yeah, I think about that every year, that giving something up. Punishing yourself can sometimes involve the same self-absorption as overindulgence. So really what's important is, the motivation. Are you drawing closer to the Lord?
Absolutely. Well, you've been listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Maria Baer, sitting in for Shane Morris this week. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. Just a quick reminder, Tuesday starts our short course with Dr. Thaddeus Williams. I'm telling you, this is the teaching. This is based on the book that I've been waiting for. On one side, we've got a culture, crying out for justice, but sometimes doing it with some really wrong categories of thought, things that we talked about on today's program. And on the other hand, you've got Christians who sometimes say, well, that's my excuse to not care about justice at all. One of the things that becomes clear throughout Scripture is that God cares about his people, and because he cares about his people, he cares that his image is treated fairly and equitably, within that biblical framework and context. And I'm just blown away by the work that Dr. Williams has done. 4 weeks, every Tuesday night. And if you cannot make any of the sessions live, we record them for all who have registered. Come to breakpoint.org/Williams. That's breakpoint.org/Williams to sign up. Begins Tuesday night, so don't miss it. And by the way, for this short course, we're offering the very first week of this short course at no charge. If you want to join us for the rest of the course, you got to register and pay a little bit, but for that first week, it's absolutely free. So again, breakpoint.org/Williams. Maria, great to have you with us.
Thanks, John. It's fun to be here.
All right, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.